And Kenny, welcome back to Hands On Apologetics.
Gary, great to be back with you. How are you, sir?
Good. Hey, your anniversary's coming up.
Yeah, I'm not sure I should be talking about Catholic things after only 4 years. It takes a while to learn how to think like a Catholic, but you're right. 4 years, Easter Vigil 2019, my whole family, my wife, my son, and I all entered into full communion with the Catholic Church. So we're so excited, and man, what a wild ride we have been on.
Yeah. So it's been 4 years in the church. Do you feel like, does it feel strange to you still, or do you feel like you fit like a pea in a pod?
I fit like a pea in a pod, for the most part. But I also realize, as a former non-Catholic Protestant, we kind of joke about having an accent. When you learn a foreign language, you have an accent. And I realize I still have a pre-Catholic accent in some of the ways that I talk. But I'm learning, I get chided. I get chided pretty frequently by the guys at the Coming Home Network for mispronouncing a saint's name or how to say a prayer or a Latin word or something like that. But I'm still learning, and I just love it. And like you said, working at the Coming Home Network, we have the joy of accompanying many guys like us, Protestant pastors and their families, into the church, and it's a wild ride for us all. So yeah, 4 years coming up in April. We're so excited and so blessed.
That's awesome. Yeah. There are these shibboleths out there that, Augustine or Augustine or, all these
exactly.
little, it's like, oh, I know where you're from. Okay.
Yeah. Papist, papacy, papacy, you have all these problems that you always hear. My favorite is Apocrypha. No, Deuterocanon,
that's an important one. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Well, even Catholics sometimes mess up on that too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, being Catholic gives you a very different worldview,
It does.
Worldview, I guess we should probably start by defining what exactly is a worldview.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a song from the 90s. I think it was DC Talk. They had this song called My Worldview. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not. No. But this is a Christian, pop rap thing. They had this song that says, and it goes, "My worldview, it's how I see the world."
Okay.
And so a worldview is, as I want to talk about it today, and especially as a Catholic, it is a comprehensive way of synthesizing reality. And you talk about reality, revolt against reality, and a lot of that has to do with people not synthesizing things according to what seems obvious or what seems harmonious in all of reality. And so you get these sort of disjointed or dislocated views of things, and you try to stick them all together, and your reality is clunky when you talk about it or when you live it out. It doesn't cohere. It's incoherent. It doesn't account for everything that's possible out there. And so a worldview is kind of a way of saying, this is how I account for everything, which is, it's kind of a big word, everything. But this is how I account for everything that I understand, know, believe, perceive, interact with, and otherwise engage in all of reality. And everybody has a worldview, which, whether you think about it or not, and the way that you kind of get there, the way you kind of get to the fact that that's true, is that worldviews, are always interacting with the world and with perceived things in the world and accounting for them. Well, this happened, so this is why that happened. And when people start answering the why questions or the how questions, that's where you figure out, aha, this is your worldview at work here. You think reality is this, fill in the blank. So it's a comprehensive view of reality. And I first started talking about, the idea of worldview with high school students about 12 years ago at a Christian high school. And, these kids are being raised in a postmodern sort of relativistic culture that we have now, very secular, very pluralistic, lots of competing ideas and realities. And so what we were trying to do is say, well, here as a Christian is a coherent view of reality to help to guide you through the complexity that you're experiencing. And we would give them five components of a worldview. So is it okay if I just outline those real quick, Gary, or do you want me to
absolutely.
take? Okay, cool. So the first thing we would do, in a worldview, the first thing any worldview has, and you can kind of take your own pulse if you're listening, like, do I have a worldview? Yes. So number one, in any worldview is the theme of knowledge. In other words, how do we know? This is the big question. How do you know? And these are where all the fights come from. It has to do with authority, and on what basis or on what grounds do you say that X is or is not true? And then we fight about how we know things. Well, when we're talking about how we know things, we're talking about epistemology. We're talking about the first component of a worldview. And everybody has one. Everybody has an answer to how do we know? How do we know things? Well, then from there, we start answering other big questions, the questions everyone has, right? Everyone that you talk to is struggling with these next four questions. And the one that comes after knowledge is, how are we here? Why are we here? Like, I started thinking about this when I was 6 or 7 or 8 years old, became kind of self-conscious that I was in a world I wasn't always here. Why was I here? Why is the world here? Why is the sun in the sky in the day and the moon at night? Why does all of this, how do I account for what I see in reality? And where does it all come from? And so now in the culture, you have lots of different competing ideas for that, where we come from and the beginning of things and the origin of things. Some people try to get there without God. Some people try to get there with lots of gods. Some people try to get there with one God, but it's a different God from your God. So there's all these answers to how we get the world that we live in. Then the third question in a worldview is, it's kind of like this: is anything wrong? Okay, we have a world. We think we can know things. We think there's a certain knowledge that's possible. We're trying to account for everything that exists. Is there anything wrong with the world? Like, can we perceive the difference between right and wrong? And would we identify those categories and put things into them? Like, what would we say is wrong? What would we say is right? What would we say is good? What would we say is evil? What would we say is, positive and negative, or good and bad? And so when we start breaking things up into categories like that, that's really the third question in a worldview. And like I said, there's lots of competing opinions for, well, what's wrong with the world, or how do we define right and wrong? And but everybody's in the game. Everybody has a worldview. So then, of course, the fourth question is related to the third question, which is, well, then how do we fix it? Like, if this is what's wrong and this is what's right, how do we get everything to be the way that it's supposed to be? How do we make the world, or how can the world be the way that it ought to be? And this is where you can see the worldview in action when you watch the news, and politicians stand up and they say, it should be this, and we should do this, and everybody should do that, and nobody should do this, and everyone ought to. So the oughts and the shoulds and musts, and here's how we fix these problems. These are very, integrated with the right and wrong question, the how do we make it better question. And like we say, there are lots of different competing opinions about or systems for how to sort through all that. So those first four questions: how do we know? How did we get here? Is there anything wrong with the world? How do we make it better? And then the last question in every worldview, coherent or not, is where is it all going? What's the future? So what? To what end? And depending on your worldview, that could be everything from there is no future, it's all just going to burn up and someday there won't be anything, or who knows, could be another answer, or some very robust and very different eschatologies and teleologies that try to talk about here's what I think the future looks like. And I, as an evangelical Protestant, had access to lots and lots of disparate and divergent views of what the future was going to look like and how we were going to get there. But all worldviews try to come at those questions. And even if somebody hasn't really thought about it, if you just sit them down and ask them one of the 5 questions, most people will have an answer. I'll just stop right there for a minute.
Yeah. Very good. Not only that, but also you had a stint as an unbeliever as well.
I did,
which would give very, very different answers to all 5 questions.
Yeah, and I was raised in in an unbelieving family, and I happened to have a mother whose answers to the question changed regularly depending on the group she happened to be hanging out with at the time, which is actually kind of like a little insight for people to kind of do a little self-assessment. Like, is my worldview the same as it was, back here? Does it change with the times, or does it change depending on who I'm hanging out with? Would I always answer these 5 questions exactly the same, no matter who I was talking to? And then maybe a second one would be, am I living inside of the world like I say I believe regarding my, stated worldview? So, this is a challenge, but I want to unpack those 5 things a little bit, maybe in the next couple of segments.
Actually, those last couple of points you made right before the break are really huge, because just because you have a worldview doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be living in accord with that worldview. So you often have like atheists living like Christians, and you have Christians living like atheists.
Yeah. Sometimes I think this is where the word hypocrite comes in really handy. but it's that tension between what I say I believe and how I assert, maybe with my words or my claims or whatever, what I say about reality, and then how I go out and live. And there needs to be, even in that, correspondence, right? Just like my worldview needs to correspond to reality, my stated worldview ought to correspond with how I live in the world. And otherwise, what I have is a tearing apart, of my own identity, a disintegration of myself from what I say is true about reality. And and all of us to some degree do that, and this is why, when we get into this solution on what's wrong with the world, or the question of what's wrong with the world, it's that we've dislocated ourselves from a Catholic perspective from the way God set things up, and we try to live inside of God's world in ways that don't correspond to how God set it up. And one of those is hypocrisy, and I say one thing with my mouth and I do another thing with my life. But being Catholic, this is why it's such a good word. Catholicity has to do with integrating all of these things together and bringing these disparate things back into a coherent, finely tuned reality, living in accordance with God and the way He set things up. But always, in every worldview, like I say, we start with the first question of how we know things. And everybody has an answer to that, right, Gary? I mean, so the materialists and the naturalists and the humanists will often say, well, we just know what we know from what we can observe in the physical world, and we can't really know anything more than that. And as Catholics, we certainly agree with the fact that we can observe things in the world. In fact, in a Catholic epistemology, that's the first thing. It's, hey, look around, check it out. There's a sun in the sky. There's, water in the ocean. There's birds that fly. There's clouds. There's heat. There's cold. Like we're Catholicism as a worldview takes into account the fact that we can observe in the concrete reality of time, space, and matter a certain set of definable characteristics, and they often repeat themselves to the point where you can say, if you like Isaac Newton's apple, if you drop it, it falls every time unless something interrupts it. So we believe in natural laws, gravity, etc. And in the sciences, Catholicism has within its proud history lots of scientific discovery and lots of scientific voices, because we see that as one of the ways we can know things. And certainly the Bible, gives us a basis for that when it calls us to pay attention, to the world around us and take it into account. Even Paul in Romans chapter 1 says there's certain things we can know about even God just from looking around, just from taking an honest account of what we see in the created world. But as Catholics, this is where I want to read a quote, Gary, you're probably familiar with him, as all of us probably are, Jordan Peterson. Not sure if you're know of Jordan Peterson. In a recent interview that he did on faith and Judeo-Christian values and so forth, this is a quote from him back in June of 2021, where he's talking about Catholicism, and he says Catholicism, quote, "I've gone through lots of Catholic cathedrals in Europe. Of course, they are stunning creations, but they're Gothic and strange. The doctrine is eerie and complex and surreal, and the biblical writings are as well. Think of the book of Revelation, for example." Then he says, "But I think Catholicism, that's as sane as people get, broadly speaking. We need a metaphysic, a narrative metaphysic to hold us together, and it has to be predicated on something that's transcendent and absolute," close quote. And I love that, because what Jordan Peterson is doing there is he's saying, look, we're all looking around at the world, but he says Catholicism takes into account the fact that not everything I can perceive with my senses, that's not the only thing that's real. And he gets into this Catholic metaphysic, which we talk about in the Creed when we say in Mass, "I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, maker of all things visible and invisible." And Jordan Peterson is saying Catholicism takes into account that not only natural sciences are part of our epistemology, but God himself has revealed things to us to help us make sense of what we can't see, and has even shown us things that would otherwise be invisible to us. So as Catholics, we have special revelation as part of our epistemological framework. First of all, God speaking to people in history, especially singling them out, and then those people putting their experiences with God into written form, an entire people coming up out of that interaction between God and humanity, to the point where they create scripture. But ultimately, as the Catechism teaches us, Jesus comes into the world and is sort of this great epistemological explosion of heaven and earth, God and humanity, the past, the present, and the future. And he's sort of the centerpiece of Catholic epistemology. And then what Jesus does, and Gary, I'll stop after I say this part. What Jesus does is he founds a church. And that church then becomes part, as a Catholic, of our epistemological framework. The way we answer, well, how do you know? These big questions, well, how do you know? And when I was not a Catholic, I will tell you, Gary, that a church, a visible church founded by Jesus. I've reflected on this a lot. It wasn't part of my epistemology. I was, okay, yeah, natural science, God, Israel, Jesus, and the Bible. Those were all very much how I tried to sort through how we know things. But now as a Catholic, I say Jesus founded a church. And the church becomes part of how we answer the how do you know questions. And I'll just pause right there for a minute.
Yeah, yeah. So it's much more simple in the sense that there's not as you don't have the complexity of all those different authorities, like you said, before you became Catholic, because obviously Jesus, but Jesus through the scriptures, and the scriptures through your seminary training and studying, and the Holy Spirit, and opinions that you've sifted through. And then you have science, and then you have to integrate science. There's a lot of working parts to that, where once you come to the conclusion that Christ founded a church and endowed it with this charism to teach in his name, it really does become quite simple that even fishermen could, have a coherent metaphysic. Yeah.
And it's so true. And I think just on a lot of reflection and introspection, I realized that a lot of my problems, for instance, in the realm of sola scriptura, I struggled with that one so much. And I realized that I was leaving the church out of so much of how I thought as a Christian. And when I sort of took the reality that Jesus founded a real, concrete, visible, actual church that you could identify in the world and sort of plugged that into the empty space, things started making sense to me. Like this one that we go back to over and over again as converts. How do you know which books go in the Bible? There was, my epistemology was sorely lacking coherence in answer to that question before I was Catholic. And now, among all of the things I would say Jesus founded a church, and the church knows, what her scriptures are, and tells us and teaches us not only what they are, but what they mean. And so, again, coherence. But also, back to Jordan Peterson's quote when he talks about metaphysics, that what we want to do as Catholics is account for all of the reality that we experience as human beings. And that's why we're not materialists. We're not, just naturalists. We don't just have a material view of reality. We have a natural and supernatural view, and these converge and they belong together. The seen and the unseen, the visible and the invisible, they are meant to be together. They live together. And so we, as Catholics, we include all of those things in the way we talk about reality. And I think that is why, for instance, Jordan Peterson says that's sanity to do that, to want to account for all those and be willing to account for all of those things. And then, of course, and we can get into this a little, we have a couple seconds before the break probably, we are saying God, to question number 2, God is the reason why everything exists that exists. And so that's really question number 2. There's a way we can know things, and what we know, question number 2, is God created the world. In simple terms, God.
Yeah.
You can say, oh, you religious people, how convenient of you, to just throw God out there. But it's true. That is really the answer to the second question in a Christian and especially a Catholic worldview. We say it in the Creed, I believe in God, the Father, the Almighty, the maker of all things visible and invisible. So in our worldview as Catholics, we don't believe that we are here on accident. We believe that we are the result of an intentional, free choice by God to create something outside of himself, which is the universe. And so, yeah, God is not dependent upon the universe. He exists prior to it and apart from it and without any dependence on it. But in a free act of love, God decides to make a universe, to make the universe, all the visible and invisible things, everything you can see and everything you can't see that are both real. And when we say, visible and invisible, we're speaking with respect to our human capacity to perceive, minus special help from God. But so we're taking into account all of reality, and we're saying God is the author. And again, back to Jordan Peterson, that's just sane. We would never, like if we went to the moon and we, are walking around on the moon and we step on a Dorito bag, hey, I think someone put a Dorito bag here on the moon. We would never think that Dorito bag just sort of oozed up over millions of years out of the dust and sand of whatever is on the surface of the moon. It's a sane response to say this world came from an intelligent mind. And as Catholics, we say that's God, the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit together participating in creation. But not only creating something, but creating the world as it is. And so it has a function. This is sort of the difference between the cosmological, argument that something exists, and then the teleological argument that says that something seems to have purpose, movement, things hang together, belong together. It seems to have design, intricacy, predictability, all kinds of things like that speak of intelligence. And that's why I use the example of a Doritos bag. Somebody really intelligent created Doritos, so our view of the second part of our worldview is that God made the world as it is, as it can be known, all of the visible and invisible things, and that we believe accounts for all of these complex realities that we as human beings experience. Before I jump into the third one, do you want to say anything there, Gary?
No, great points, and I'll just let you go from there.
Yeah. So then, of course, the third one, as Christians, we're saying we're asking, is anything wrong with the world? Right. And our answer as Catholic Christians is yes, there is something wrong with the world. God created the world in divine revelation in Scripture. He created to be very good. That's God's intention for the world, is that it be very good. This is the final words after creation. God saw all that he made, and behold, it was all very good. And then, of course, in the next part of the story, human beings made in God's image begin living in the world contrary to God and his design for the world. They begin, to quote this famous Catholic apologist, having a revolt against reality. They try to live in God's world in ways that don't correspond to the way God created the world. Well, what that does is it's like untuning a piano or a guitar, or breaking a piece of glass. It's not meant to be broken, but something comes along and breaks it and fractures it. Now it's not existing as God made it to exist. And so what we say about that is that's sin, that something has happened to the world to break it, to move it from God's created intentions for it to some other way of being. And this is why we live in the world with the kinds of things that we experience, moral evil, in some cases natural evil, accidents, people hurting themselves, dying, getting diseases, committing crimes, etc. This is all the result of human beings living in the world contrary to God's created intentions for it. And, there's a Catholic word for that is disordered. So the opposite of that is ordered. We believe that God created an ordered world. So what's wrong with the world? People have brought disorder into it through their choices and their influence on others and so forth. And that's really how we account for the problems that we see in the world, the problem of evil and so forth. It all goes back to choices being made by human beings and by these other creations of God, angels, the invisible creatures, choosing to rebel against God and unleashing evil in God's world. Well, the fourth element in our Catholic worldview is, okay, how do we fix this? How do we make this better? If sin is the problem, then the solution to the problem is the reversal of that and getting things back to the way God intended them to be in the first place, and especially with respect to human beings participating in the breaking of the world. So now we need the human race to participate in the restoration of the world with God, to take God's hand again, as it were, and walk backwards out of Adam and Eve's footsteps back to the way that God meant for the world to be in the first place. And so, we have, I think it's Father Mike Schmitz calls them the fall team, that's Adam and Eve, and the salvation team, that's Jesus and Mary, right? So they are going to reverse through their willing participation with God in the un-Adam and Eving of the world back into what it was meant to be. So humans mess up the world, if you can say it that way. Human beings mess up the world as God created it. Human beings, with cooperation from God, restore the world back to its God's created intentions for it. And the way that works in practical terms, in gospel terms, is you and I decide which version of the human race we're going to follow during the course of our life. We either follow the rebellious Adam and Eve, and we bring destruction upon the world and ourselves ultimately, and we go into the grave and we die. This is what God says to Adam and Eve, you die. Or we follow the second Adam and the second Eve, saying yes to God with every ounce of our life, even through death, and we die and we go into the grave and we are raised up, risen again, and restored to God's original created intentions for us as human beings. And this is a real high level, sort of simple gospel presentation. This is why we follow Jesus, and why Mary is our great example of what it means to follow Jesus, because this is how God is restoring what's wrong with the world, through his obedient partner in the human race, the male and female human race. And of course, the last thing in the worldview is, for what? Where's it all headed? And what we say as Catholics is, what you see in Jesus is what you see in the future. So what? A resurrected humanity ascended into the heavenly places, fully restored in body and spirit, the visible and the invisible, completely merged together. And the biblical picture that we have this in the book of Revelation is, behold, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The former was passed away, and the new heaven and earth are joined together again. How so? Well, back like they were in Eden, heaven and earth perfectly overlapping, God dwelling with his people again in that reality of visible and invisible, but with no veil between them. And that's a real high level view of how Catholics understand the reality that we live in here in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Summing up all things in Christ, and beautiful exposition. And you did it within the program. I thought this would be a multiple part program, because your points are so profound. We probably could do like an entire program on each of the 5 points. But
I would love to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. But we only have a couple of minutes left, and I want to talk about, catch up with you. What have you been doing at the Coming Home Network?
It seems like almost every time, or a couple times a year when I get on with you, I talk about having just come from a retreat. We have a retreat a couple times a year. And it just so happens that last week we had our Coming Home Network retreat in Ohio. And this is where we bring people who are on their journey into Catholicism. And we had with us at the last retreat several pastors from other traditions. This is kind of like for people who might be listening. We help pastors outside of the Catholic Church come home to the Catholic Church and become Catholic. And we had several with us at the last retreat. And one of them, Gary, a United Pentecostal pastor, and his wife, who had grown up Catholic, after 41 years, they came back home to the Catholic Church. And at our retreat, because they had gone through all the sacraments as young people, with our Monsignor, our chaplain, they made their reconciliation with the church the second day of the retreat, and the third day returned to full communion with the Catholic Church at the Mass at our retreat. So that's what I've been up to. I've been we're working with our team to bring people back into full communion with Jesus and his beautiful Catholic Church. And it's so fun. It's so fun to be part of that. So among other things that I'm up to. So
yeah. Well, hey, thank you so much for coming on the show. As always, I always learn so much from you, Kenny, and it's just fun chatting with you. So thanks again for coming on.